take a second. It's
Okay.
going to take. Okay, there we go. Now we're good to go.
Okay. We're going. Okay. We're joined by Jon Mackenzie today. Alex and David here as always. Jon is a freelance football journalist, has a background in all sorts of interesting areas of academia. Jon, how are you?
Yeah, really good. It's good to be with you guys.
Excellent. Now, one of the things I thought we might just get things rolling here with a question for you about the media, and we can see where it goes. Usually, these conversations take on a bit of a life of their own, which is cool, which is no problem. And one of the things we've been talking about, Alex, David, and I, with a couple of other guests, is that from a coaching perspective, it seems as though there's a problem with defining any kind of set hard causality within football, and we find that in terms of how to train players, does that result in how do you measure it in good play, and it's all very disputed at best, right? So I was wondering, given that, from a media perspective, how much of media do you think is actually just narrative construction, right, rather than some kind of, I don't know, or realistic representation of the actual reality that's unfolded? I don't know if that makes sense. Is that question?
I guess my question to that would be, well, isn't everything narrative construction at some level? Which isn't just to sort of do the boring counter argument thing, but I suppose that the question is which narrative and who controls it. And I think partly the problem with, and we talked about this a lot, you and I already, but part of the problem is that there's a consensus about who constructs the narrative, who's in control of the narrative. And as a result of that, there's a very narrow understanding of who the media are. And anything that trespasses outside that line of canon can often be called into question. Similarly, those people who are outside the canon, those people who are on the periphery, are also can be critical of the mainstream media in ways that I think is unfair as well. So I guess there's a whole load of defining that we need to do before we can really get into a meaty critique of the media, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And from your perspective, then, where do you see that balance of power lying at the moment? If that's possible to describe.
I think the balance of power, I mean, it's always been the case, I think, that the media is a processual thing. You have the mainstream, the center is always changing, but it does also behave in predictable ways. At the same time, the periphery is always changing, but behaves in predictable ways as well. And the process that I see existing between those two phenomena is you have the mainstream, which is always going to be small c conservative. It's always going to be status quoist. It's always going to be tentative in what it does. And the periphery, for obvious reasons, right, insofar as they have to placate certain individuals or corporations that they see giving them their edge, and if they don't do that, then they'll be called into question, whether or not that's access on the one hand, because a lot of the mainstream media, especially in the sports media, considers access to be its lifeblood, which is another question that we can talk about whether or not that is the case. But also, obviously, when you're getting your money through ad revenue, or when you're getting your income through very specific means, you don't want to be pushing the boat out too far. And then on the other hand, you've got the periphery who are always having to innovate, because if they don't do that, then they just die. And I think there's the slow drain of history is that what happens is that those people on the periphery who do well slowly get bought out by the mainstream as the mainstream interprets trends to come and go, and so you generally have that evolutionary process where you have the center, and then certain people at the periphery will be pulled into it. So I don't think much has changed. I think that's broadly the same reality that we're in now. The question is how well the centre who's going to respond to various challenges that have come up in recent years. But again, that's open for discussion and open for questioning.
Yeah, and if you're going to put your finger on, well, obviously the like you say, there's some fresh challenges, let's say, for mainstream media, and obviously not just football. How well do you think the mainstream, if you want to put it like that, how well do you think it is doing at this point in time, where it seems to be, where there's quite a lot of radical transition going on in how people are consuming media and what people think of media? Do you think that, I know we can talk about maybe just specifically UK, but do you think that they are handling that well, let's say? Do you think they're integrating the stuff from the periphery effectively, or do you think they're always going to be behind, obviously by definition, but do you think they're proving able to deal with the rate of change that's happening on that periphery?
I think to talk about this, you basically there's a few things you have to talk about. In the sports media, you have to talk about the Athletic, obviously. What is the Athletic? Is the Athletic the old media in its sort of last gasp, trying to co-opt the new media space? Which I think is probably pretty much my interpretation of it. And the question then becomes: Are they simply trying to save anything they can from the old media, but under the sort of guise of the new media? So it looks as though what they're doing is new media, but actually everyone who works for it has pretty much worked in the old media their whole career. They're not doing anything particularly innovative. Maybe they're doing a bit more slow journalism, but I don't see that as being particularly new media. That's one question. I think outside of that, in the media in general, it has to come down to questions about the structural facets of media. So how well are companies responding to social media in particular? So things like the Google algorithm, how well are media outlets responding to the Google algorithm? How are they responding to Facebook in terms of the mechanics behind it, in terms of getting exposure through that way? Twitter, obviously, as well. But even now, aspects such as TikTok, stuff like that. Again, as we've said, the old media doesn't really have its skin in the game necessarily. But what we're starting to see, I think, is subscription models as well, I should say, add to that, because I think we're starting to see that happening now. So you're seeing things like Disney being a major corporation who are suddenly getting to grips with the concept of actually being available. And you can't simply rely on the fact that you're a traditional outlet that people will search out. It's all come down to whether or not you are going to make yourself available to people where they're at. And I think what's happened in the last 5 years has been, at least from my reading of the media as an industry, is that we're starting to see a lot of those big corporations. We're starting to see big news organizations actually thinking about the way that they're engaging with their readership and their listenership and their viewership, or whatever it is. And again, that sort of fits into my paradigm, which is, the mainstream is always going to be a bit behind, but when push comes to shove, they've got the money that can just bring in people on the periphery and make themselves relevant again. Which is why I find it kind of hard to sort of just be railing against the mainstream media all the time, because there's an extent to which they have to do that, or at least it's not in their interest to not do that. Obviously, I would like to see the mainstream media doing more interesting things, but at the same time, we've seen the death of print media pretty much in our lifetime. And the profit margins that the print media were making were wild back in the day. And I think there's a lot of people who still work in that industry who are still expecting that sort of profit margin, and they're slowly realizing it's just not the case. So there's loads of things going on. Sorry, I've really rambled on from where the question was, but these are all the sorts of questions that have to be being raised. And I guess we going to the Athletic might be the best place to go, given that we're talking about football in general. And my question is going to be, how long are the Athletic going to try and keep doing the stuff that they're already doing without having the platform to be able to bring in people who are doing a different type of media, and actually just expand their boundaries? But I don't know what their long-term projects are, and I don't think they know either, I hasten to add. I mean, when they launched at the beginning of the season, they basically upscaled quickly. They hadn't planned to release this season. I think they were going to plan on the season after, but they got to a point where they were like, if we can get it out over a course of 6 months. I think I was talking to Ed Malyon, the UK CEO, and they basically had 6 months when they contacted him. He had to present a vision and then build a department and a website and everything within that 6 months. They only brought the podcasting in 6 months after they launched. Podcasting is obviously a good way of being able to reach out to an audience that includes more than simply the traditional sports media audiences. And I don't think they've done a particularly great job there. They brought a lot of people in from the radio industry rather than what I would like to see, which is bringing people in from the periphery who are doing creative things in terms of what you can do with radio as a medium or podcasting as a medium. They've done nothing with video. I know that they've done a bit in the US with that, but they haven't really thought through, I don't think, the concept. For me, you've got to bring in people like, and it's, again, it's really tough because this always ends up just becoming just mere taste, right? So you say, well, what do I like? This is good media, therefore you should be doing that, and if you're not doing that, then somehow you're doing it wrong. But people like someone like Ellie Menjum, you've got to get someone like that in, someone doing decent fan media. You've got to get YouTubers in, you've got to get people who are doing Twitch streaming in. There's just so many ways open for them to explore, and by all means they should be doing what they've been doing all their careers and have been doing well with the written media. But the written media has never been more precarious than it is now, and you can't simply, I don't think, trick people into being consumers of the written media in the way that they seem to be doing, and just sort of pretending that they're doing something that everyone else isn't doing for free. You've got to be thinking, how do I develop or brand loyalty and audience awareness of what we've got, and do more than what everyone else is doing. And I just don't think they're doing that at the moment. But
well, do you feel personally, like based on what you talked about earlier about this small c conservative in the mainstream media and these advertising revenues, do you feel personally like it's difficult to stay authentic then? And maybe that might be one reason why YouTubers aren't coming on, or those people aren't wanting to get involved because they have to write something that's going to be based on the narrative that their parent company is asking them to, or along those lines?
Yeah, I think the concept of authenticity is a really tricky one, right? Because I've already mentioned Al Menjum, who goes around doing all of this fan media stuff. I don't find him particularly authentic.
He's Copper 90, right?
Yeah, Copper 90. Yeah. So he's the guy who does all the Derby Days stuff.
Yeah. Okay.
And people enjoy that. But do people think that it's more authentic than what the mainstream are doing? I don't think so. I just think that they're doing something that's maybe a little bit more attractive to what most people want to watch. People want to see those sorts of stories about football in different places where you have an awareness of what's going on, but then someone actually goes there and shows you doing it. And the authenticity thing is really tricky. Again, the Athletic is a funny example of that, because they've started getting old media guys doing things like, I went on the team bus to a game, and basically explaining what fandom looks like to an audience who are fans. And you can't talk about authenticity. It shouldn't be trying to trick people into thinking that you're just one of them, or if it is, the people who are going to be best at it are going to be fan media types. So I think this is why, again, where I think that the Athletic maybe haven't thought really about what they're doing. There tends to be a little bit of an identity crisis there, and a lot of the old media, I think, actually don't engage with a lot of audiences because they aren't fans, and that's fine. And I think there's an extent to which, if you're going to be in a press box covering games, you lose the ability to be a fan to a certain extent. I say that as someone who's done that. I mean, I've been lucky that I haven't had to do too much in the press box at Leeds, and whenever I've done that, I've done it from a perspective where I'm not doing like on the whistle reports and stuff like that. So I've actually just been able to watch the game as a fan. But it definitely changes your approach to it. So when it comes to authenticity, I think that's a real challenge. I think authenticity is a buzzword that people want to say. Everyone, if you can get authenticity and people will feel happier, I think, part with their money. That's maybe true, but at the same time, I think it is more just about, especially with these big companies, like how do we respond to the consumptive needs of our audience? And that's where the Athletic are going wrong. It's not that they're not authentic; it's that they just aren't really hitting the right spots.
Well, I think that's an interesting case study almost, isn't it? Because we've got the situation then where we're trying to, something like the Athletic is trying to say, you said like an identity crisis, trying to say, well, what is it that people are going to want to see here? What do we want to be? But the problem is and something we've talked about, is that football seems to be all manner of different things to all manner of different people.
Yeah.
And this is and perhaps now we're seeing this like fragmentation. We're seeing lots of all this new alternative media come up from various different perspectives, tactical, analytical, fan culture, right? All these different niches, right? Then it becomes difficult for some kind of singular identity, right? Because then because you're trying to hit so many areas, right? And I don't know if you've got any thoughts about that, about the idea of what, how the media handles that aspect, that football is not one thing, right? And it is so many different things to so many different people, almost down to an individual level. This seems to be like at the heart of some of these challenges, right?
Yeah, and I think part of the identity crisis here is that the old media has always done things in a certain way, and what we're seeing now is new kids on the block. So in terms of what the Athletic is doing, they brought in people like Michael Cox, and I think that's good that they brought someone like him in. They've also brought in Tom Warville, who was at Opta, and again, that's a great thing to do, because when you're trying to get your writers to be more tactically aware and more statistically aware, you can't just simply tell them to do that. You need to have some means whereby they can actually do it. And so bringing someone like Tom in is a great idea. The reason why I'm not particularly impressed with him is the reason why Tom got the job in the first place was because he approached them and said, look, there's a gap in your approach which I can fill. They're not going out there looking for those people. They're relying on those people coming in and offering themselves. Maybe this comes back to the causality thing. Maybe the issue here is that people think that there's a grand plan behind everything, but whatever works in the media tends to be a little bit more incidental and accidental. Which is, I guess, again, it's coming back to what we were talking about in midweek, Jamie, where we were talking about the way that the history of tactics has developed, and maybe the history of media isn't this sort of scientific billiard ball type causality that we seem to think of causality being, and maybe it is a bit more rhizomatic in the sort of Foucauldian sense, the postmodern sense, that actually things bubble up, and there are conurbations all over the place, and some things work, and when they work, and there's not a huge amount of intellectual endeavor that's gone into why that might be the case. But again, I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's obviously something we've talked about, and something we've talked about on David and Alex. We've talked about it as well, and that idea of this more fluid, random causality, that seems to might be not exactly one of the narratives that certainly mentioned analytics there, for example, because the whole thing's based on causality, right? On like a more linear causality, assigning metrics to things, and this is why such and such happened. Do you think there's a perhaps a lack of acknowledgement of this randomness within football media in general? Or I suppose I'm asking, is there more of a bias towards this more analytical perspective, or is that maybe me seeing something that isn't there?
Are you asking whether or not they think that there's some grand plan behind everything?
Yeah, just that there seems to be a trend towards including this more analytical stance on things, which is fine. But
can you give me some concrete examples of what you mean by that? Sorry to be
no, not at all.
banal about it.
Well, no, I suppose maybe it's just the Twitter feeds that the Twitter niches that I follow, but certainly I think you got things like Michael Calley, double pivot pod, the big voice, things like expected goals, right, have popped up onto match of the day, right, this kind of thing. There seems to be a move towards including this kind of thing in the general discussion of football. And I wonder whether or not that is flying in the face of some of this more random ideas that we've been talking about, and whether or not you think that's necessarily a good thing for the game, whether it's representative of how other people see it and interact with it, or is that something that's more top down, do you think?
Yeah, there's lots of ideas that are sort of percolating in my head as you're asking that question. I think one of them is that I've generally been of the opinion that that society is generally scientistic, in the sense that there's an assumption that if someone says science, somehow it's a sort of knockdown, drag out argument for something being true. At the same time, I feel like we live in a society where more than ever, you've been able to pick and choose your experts depending on how they suit your argument. I think we're certainly seeing that in the UK at the moment, where the media can come out and say, you know, the British government has changed its policy on how to deal with coronavirus because the science changed, which, I mean, everyone knows is just a palpably, I think, unfair description of what actually happened in that situation. So I think the response to that probably, the response to whether or not it was a matter of time before statistical analysis entered into the media sphere, which I think is what your question is touching on, is that inevitable? Then yeah, I think probably it is, because I think the assumption is as soon as you start throwing numbers around, that you're somehow saying something that's more true than someone who's doing narrative work, which, I mean, is true to a certain extent, but depending on how you're going to value what truth should be, which again isn't to make a banal point, but is to say, if you consider the phenomenon of football to be purely mechanistic, which I think a lot of stats people do implicitly, whether or not they admit that fact, then if you can say something that is able to be clarified and able to be set out in numbers, then it will sound better than Miguel Delaney writing something where he's doing an op-ed piece which is not attached to numbers. But yeah, at the same time, I do think there's that whole other shadow side of the scientism of this society, which is you can just dismiss it quite easily just through a sleight of hand and say, oh well, you know, football isn't played on a spreadsheet, which is something that we get thrown our way. I have a Leeds fan account which is stats and tactics focused, and I do that because I think I think it's an interesting aspect of the game, and I don't think anyone else was really covering it before we did. But somehow I'm now held up amongst the Leeds fans as being someone who's a paragon of this belief that you can explain everything with numbers. But I don't know. I always talk about cars when it comes to it's a really banal example, but you know, you can enjoy cars without understanding how a car works, but you can also enjoy understanding how a car works. And I see the same with football. I think a lot of people enjoy football without really understanding how it works, and you can also understand how football works without really enjoying it. But I think that the problem is that everyone who has their own particular approach to what the phenomenon of football is struggles to really appreciate what maybe other people's appreciation of what the phenomenon of football is, and that's where the tensions start coming out. So sorry, again, that's a really random way.
How would you define knowing how football works?
In a more sort of mechanistic way. So in the same sense that you could treat football as a science, and you can say, well, we'll treat this phenomenon of football as an object which we can study and we can quantify using numbers, and then if we apply statistical analysis to those numbers, we can start saying something about what you might term as being true about the game. But then the question becomes, well, you know, I've got a lot of friends who think that if someone doesn't really understand what a footballer is doing, then they're not really saying anything useful about the game, which is, I mean, I guess arguably true. But the problem comes from the fact that on the one hand, you get these people who will say just seemingly obviously wrong statements about the game, about the way that someone plays. Like Paul Pogba is a great example of that. It's very easy to say Pogba doesn't do anything on the field, or Man United would be better without Pogba, or something like that. But I think that the people who say those kind of things then take umbrage to the fact that someone says, actually, you're wrong. But similarly, I think there's a sense in which the statistical analysis in football can never touch on the more meaningful aspects of football. And for me, it just seems patently obvious that you just have to be aware that you're going to have to be doing, when you're talking about football, you're talking about a multifaceted phenomenon, and there's going to be different ways to be able to talk about it. In the same way that you could talk about the build up of a piece of art and talk about it in very specific mechanistic terms and practical terms about how you might produce something like that. But at the same time, that isn't to say that you can't just sit back and look at it and write about it as a piece of art in and of itself, and the experiential emotions that emerge when you experience that as well. So I think, it's just, I think where the media has gone wrong is that it hasn't really been able to hold all of these differing approaches to the sport together. And I think what we're seeing now is the fact that all of those are being brought together, because you have to do that now, because sports departments or media departments are now so small that you're not simply doing the one thing or the other. You're no longer just a journalist. You have to be a multimedia journalist, and you have to be able to do all kinds of things. I mean, and the coronavirus has made that more palpably aware than any other time, right? When you've got these people who are used to just spaffing out stuff about games that they've been to, and suddenly those games aren't on, and then suddenly they don't know what to do. They aren't creative enough to be able to write stuff that the fan base actually want to read. So yeah, I think that's the thing that's facing the media now. It's this awareness of the diversification or the diversity of football itself. That you've got to be able to tap into that diversity, because you're naturally going to be able to reach more viewers and audience. So how do you get around that? I don't know, but that's what I think, for me anyway, what the modern media scenario is going to look like.
Well, it's a symptom of a bigger cultural problem, which might go back, you read someone like Goethe, who's Nietzsche's romantic hero, and then you have this turn with Francis Bacon and the Industrial Revolution, the rise of modern scientism. So that might just be a symptom of a larger cultural problem. Well, I see things, and you hear this from coaches like, it's got to be from my gut. And then you hear this from maybe the newer generation, like, no, let's look at the analytics. So yeah, that's really interesting to me, this bigger cultural problem between science and art, maybe.
So here's a question. I guess we'll leave it open for anybody, but we've got this sort of interesting case where in what would have been near the end of the season, football stopped, but all the events surrounding the game have more or less gone on, like you're saying, whether it be journalism or any different media platforms, and people thinking, speaking, analyzing, and whatever media they use. That's still going on. But the game itself is stopped, which of course happens in the off season as well. But do we think that would influence like the on the pitch game when it returns? To have this sort of a hiatus and the continuation of the non-football part of football, I guess.
I feel like I've spoken a lot, so I'm happy to let other people interject at this point.
Alex, you want to go?
Well, one thing that came up was that people might be, and I didn't say this, it was from Raymond's webinar or whatever, but people might be experimenting during this time. So maybe the more conservative coaches might come out with new, innovative ways of doing things on the pitch that they wouldn't have before, because they have time to think about it. That might be one thing that happens out of this that translates to the pitch.
Well, there's one thing I mentioned. I went on a bit of a rant the other night with you, John, about this, and yeah, I think that's an interesting question, right? Because this is it's a almost unique situation, right? Like you say, it happens in the off season, right? Fair enough, but we've been jolted out of this thing in full flow, and I've been thinking about what do we mean by innovation, and this is probably linked to just what we've been talking about a little bit in this sort of the scientific worldview, and a lot of the innovations I see from where I am, maybe taking in some coaching theory and coach education and this kind of thing. A lot of the innovations are like systemic, right? They're like, how does this, if you interpret the game mechanistically, right, and how it functions system v system, and break it down, how can I tweak the system, right? Like John, you mentioned a car. If I'm a Formula One engineer, right, how can I tweak this engine, right, to actually get myself the edge? And I think that's really interesting and obviously good, because that helps you win games, and it's interesting to innovate in that way. But then the difference, obviously, is that the components of this engine, right, are not inanimate objects, right? They're human beings, right? The ultimate, mystery, right? So we're using. So then, is there room for innovation on a human level in some way? Whether that's to do with, we've talked about collective intelligence, where fusing people together in a more coherent way. Is there something to do with the individual's relationship with the ball, that can come up with a new technique that could be used to an advantage? Something like that. Something maybe that isn't so perhaps systemic, which I see more talked about, let's say. And I think there's maybe again, I don't want to project my own stuff on, but that happens anyway. But maybe that's something that I see more, it's fashionable these days to talk more about systems, tactics, analytics, than maybe the human being, individual playing the game. And that's maybe something that this break might give us time to think about. I don't know if that makes sense, David.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, I think what's kind of percolating in my head is that football is not an iterative game, say like chess, right? Because while you're on the pitch, it's just there's no turns, right? You just play. But in a sense, it is, because you've got this rhythm where you've got game, maybe 2 games a week, and then you've got a few months in the summer, where teams are constantly adjusting and reacting and acting in this complex interaction with all the other teams. But what you've got now is where it's just paused. So then it's almost, I wonder if people are, without that sort of a feedback, right? The consistent periodic, like, oh, we've got a game every week. We've been doing this in training. We've been trying this, or we've signed this player. But now it's like all that's going to continue, but without the feedback. So it's like everybody's acting and reacting almost blindly. And I'm curious, like, if that's going to have some type of a nonlinear effect once everything resumes.
Yeah, I think, well, potentially. It depends what people come up with, I suppose, and whether of course, the nature of this break is that we can't actually do anything really. We can't do anything particular physically, right? It's like we actually can't train. So even if there's an innovation, it's theoretical, right? And it's not. As long as this continues like this, we're not going to be able to try it out. And okay, that you're talking about getting the feedback, but yeah, so maybe this opens up space for more outside of the box thinking, right? Or maybe people are going to run with different ideas for a little bit longer. I don't know. I think it's an interesting question because it's open, right? And I would say it's an opportunity to do that, right? To reconsider things and think things from a different perspective. But whether or not once it just gets starting again, it just all the pressures that you mentioned at the start just kick back in immediately, and you just kind of revert to time.
So like we've spoken about this before. One of my pet peeves is when people speak about like the evolution of tactics, and I think we were watching that video a while ago. The guy was like, "Oh, it's the end of tactics. There's only so many ways you can arrange 11 players on a pitch, and blah blah blah." It's like, well, from my perspective at least, it's not important how you arrange 11 players on the pitch. It's the 11 players versus the other 11 players. So even if there's some tactical innovation, we've spoken about like how it gets assimilated into the game, or in American sport, baseball, Billy Beane did the analytic thing and he did the Moneyball thing, but like after a decade or two, like it's just like, oh yeah, cool, he had a good idea, and now it's just like old hat. Nobody would blink twice at that. So the
Moneyball's now out of date, right? Moneyball only worked when you were the outlier doing that.
Exactly.
Because the issue with Moneyball is that you're misvaluing things.
Yeah.
And as soon as everyone's valuing everything better, then you lose your edge completely.
Yeah. So I guess it's maybe for me, it's the context that matters as well, as opposed to like an absolute evolution towards some type of a platonic ideal or something. I don't know.
Yeah, there's so many things I think that are really interesting about the temporal aspect of what's going on that people just haven't considered. I mean, one development is completely dependent upon the idea of playing football. So there's going to be a whole generation of kids who are going to miss a chunk of their development out because they can't play football, and there's literally nothing that you can do about that when competitive football isn't happening. And there's going to be a whole chunk of statistical data that's going to be thrown off. because say that, I mean, we don't know until they decide what they're going to do with the season, but say they void or they play the final 9 games of the season in an accelerated time frame, the stats that are going to get thrown up by that are going to be misrepresentative because they aren't within the same time frame as they usually are, and so you're suddenly getting this I guess misrepresentative bunch of numbers as well. And I think there's so many things like that where you're not going to be actually able to anticipate it really until we have a much better idea of what this time frame is going to look like, what people are doing outside of that. I mean, there's going to be a whole load of people now doing a load of tactical, analytical, a load of analysis basically for recruitment, who are going to be using stats that are effectively going to be way out of date by the time they bring their players in. You've got a load of players who are going to be not match fit when they come back as well. So again, that will have a knock on in terms of their statistical data as well. So I suspect that there's going to be a lot of negatives here as well as positives. I know there's the time for the intellectual creativity, but there's also like the raw data of football is not happening at the moment. And there's no way that that's not going to have an impact. But coming back to what you were saying about the tactics as well, I mean, you mentioned chess being an iterative game, but chess is an interesting one as well insofar as what's happened now is there's been much more computer analysis of chess going on, and what we're seeing is that because the computer can compute at such a higher level than the human brain, we're seeing certain moves that people would never have considered being considered actually quite strong moves. So particularly pawn moves down the 2 flanks never used to happen because it was considered that the center of the board was more important. Now we're realizing that actually those pawns on the outside are quite strong because they can only be attacked by one side. And so we're seeing younger players who are much more tuned into computer analysis of chess, pushing their flank pawns. Right. And I wonder whether or not something like that might happen in football, whether or not there's a realization that actually the more data that we have, the further we go down here and the more powerful computer processing becomes, which you start getting tracking data and stuff like that, there's going to be a realization that certain positions in football are stronger than they're given credit for. And so you'll almost have that Moneyball perspective there. You'll get an outlier in terms of a coach will come along realizing that actually a position is much stronger than I mean, that's what's happened with Klopp, right? He plays his fullbacks in a way that no one else has done before as a sort of creative outlet for their team, and it's really benefited them. But sorry, there's lots of ideas I've just thrown in there as well. But
so, like, just what you're saying with chess, with the flank pawns and that, but like, is that so much in a vacuum something that was an innovation, or was it innovation against the backdrop of, say, a common heuristic of using the center of the board or whatnot? You know, like you said, maybe there was a space there to be exploited.
So I think so. The impression that I get is that that you get computers now telling you that certain moves are better than other moves.
Yeah.
And people don't really know why, because you don't see the benefit of why that's a good move until so many more moves further than the human brain can really compute accurately, that you're just sort of taking it on good faith that the computer is right. But obviously, when you start seeing those happening, you start realizing that there are patterns to these things. And so you realize actually pushing that pawn might be a good idea rather than doing what the traditional move is. But again, I'm no expert in chess, and I'm certainly no expert in computer evaluation of chess. But I just find that kind of thing quite fascinating, that actually if you can improve your processing power to orders of magnitude, then suddenly, because I've always just assumed that we have a sort of progressive view of the history of tactics or the history of like chess, which is, you know, slowly but surely you're going to asymptotically approach this like perfect ideal on the graph. But what I found so interesting about chess is that that's not really the case. You can't really solve chess, because when you bring in a computer, it's not that it tells you how to do things better. It tells you how to do things differently, and that's why they're better. And so I guess I would like to apply that logic to football as well, where it's not just simply, well, if we can do what Guardiola does better than what Guardiola's teams do, then we're necessarily going to end up at the perfect form of football, when actually it may simply be the case that actually there's a different, better way of doing football, which you don't actually need to have players intrinsically playing better. They just need to understand the mechanics of the game in a different way, and then it will produce a more effective way of playing.
That's a cool way of putting it, actually, I think, because Yeah, this idea of rather than copying, it's difference that really is that you're looking for, and that sort of links into that idea of authenticity as well, right? And it's like, okay, you have to be able to be prepared, right, to do something differently, and that's quite a big ask, right? In anything, right, is to say, okay, look, I understand conventional wisdom, right? I understand the way things are done around here, but hey, how about this? And of course, it's got to, you don't just listen to any madcap idea. It's got to have some kind of practical result to it. But just the that process by which people, whether it's players, coaches, whoever it is, thinking about football, has that. What would you say? Just that belief to actually try and do that, right? Which is something that in terms of coaching ideas, I don't see push that far, because obviously it's a dangerous idea, right? Is to say just you need to come up with something on your own like that. But it seems to be a lot of the time what we get is copy and paste stuff, right? Play like Barcelona, be like Klopp, play like this system, do this system. And it's right, okay, it's good to understand these things, but to be authentic, right, you need to have some kind of difference, right,
Well,
of what we're doing.
for me, like a key constraint on that difference is that it has to expose an assumption about what was common before. That was It was before it was exposed, it was just taken for granted, and then it becomes apparent when somebody innovates. So I think that for me that constrains, because otherwise you could just go anywhere you want and it may not be relevant. But if you make a difference in a way that somehow reveals some soft underbelly of what's currently there, then I think that's for me what innovates.
Yeah. And I think in terms of not just the tactical moving and tinkering of the X's and O's and the systems, but there's that room to be innovative in bringing in influence, let's say, from maybe fields of thinking or knowledge or human experience that haven't traditionally been associated with the practice that you're in, right? Which is something we've talked about, is trying, and football perhaps doesn't do that as well as it might, in terms of bringing in knowledge, ideas from various different schools of thinking, right? It's not, it could be from science, analytics, right? But also just anthropology, right? Religion, like wherever, music, art. There's lots of different ways, I think, in terms of being innovative, right? I think it seems to be that there's more areas, right, than just tactical tinkering that you can be innovative in when you're playing football. But I maybe that I just see sometimes we get bogged down on the X's and O's of what we're doing when we are actually working with human beings, and our understanding of humans isn't particularly good, I would say. I think it's
Agreed.
especially if you look at like sort of neuroscience research, we don't really know what's going on, and maybe there's elements of how we actually interact as human beings in a group that can be where the innovation comes from.
Well, I'm wondering why you think that is the case, because I find that also very interesting. Like, it seems to me that the best coaches, they come out and say these things. Like, I think Nagelsmann said something recently, like it's 90% tactics or 90% dealing with people and 10% tactics. But why do you think then it is the case that our focus is so much on the X's and O's as opposed to dealing with the human side?
Well, I would put it, but I would generally say it's like what we touched upon earlier when we talked about the scientific worldview, right? And I know it's fine, and absolutely, as John said, we don't obviously not dismissing it, obviously, right? It's not. I mean, you can hold both, but I think you can hold both and hold lots of different parts. But I would say there's a trajectory as well in play here, and there's a trend towards that is going up and has been going up over a period of time towards having a more scientific view of things, right?
And this is true in almost every domain, it seems to me, right? Yeah.
Right. It's like, okay, we can say there's that we can recognize the difference, but I think the trend is definitely in favor, or has been certainly, and still is, I would say, in favor of a more materialistic, mechanistic, scientific way of analyzing things, right? The world. And there's that. I think the rate of that change of that is accelerating as well. And I think that as time goes by, more and more people will and are thinking about things in that way, which I think is just obviously effective in certain situations, but also it leaves out a hell of a lot.
So we need a gay science then.
Right,
There's almost like a Pascalian wager, though, isn't it? I think that's
Yeah.
what happens, and it's not about being right or wrong. It's about knowing whether or not you're right or wrong. And I think a lot of the people that I follow who tend to be more mechanistic in their approach to football seem to be more worried about being wrong than about being interesting. And I think that's a really key distinction, because I think most of us know, and I think even most scientists know, that you have to. There's a difference between holding an assumption that something could be true and to the best of our knowledge is true, and then assuming that that assumption isn't there, and just acting as though the things that we are acting as though they are true are just unquestionably true. And I think that a lot of people make that sort of wager early on, which is, we can only really know about things if we can actually apply numbers to them, or can apply some kind of heuristic that is, I guess, believable. And anything that isn't within that frame of reference is therefore not within the domain of truth. And I think it's unhelpful, because I think that, like you say, when it comes to coaching, there's so much more to coaching than simply saying, well, we know that if you make this run, then you're going to end up with having a more likely outcome that there's going to be a goal at the end of it, or something like that. Which may be true and may be helpful, but again, that's only true and helpful within a frame of reference where you're making assumptions about what counts as being true or not. And again, it comes back to this notion of what we were talking about before, which is this notion of diversity of a field. You have to be aware that as a coach, you're going to be moving into different fields and different contexts in which there are going to be different sets of assumptions about what will and won't count as being true or worthwhile. And again, I think that a lot of the people, particularly on Twitter, who are like big on tactics, big on stats, but who aren't actually working in the industry, they sort of have that as an attitude, which is, I'm smart because I understand the numbers, and therefore my understanding of football is better than yours. Which may well be the case, but again, you have to be honest about your assumptions, right? Essentially.
Yeah, and it's also that when you smuggle it, they also smuggle in. If they said something like, if the statement is something, I understand football better than you, it's like you're smuggling in your definition of what football is, right? You're making it some abstract thing, and it's actually, for me anyway, it's not abstract, right? Football is only football when it's played, right? It's like, it's an event that takes place with human beings moving around on a pitch, and the idea that you can look. I don't want to sort of. I think this is important, right? And I think that maybe it's undervalued somewhat. Is this understanding of how the complexities that go into that, and they're just endless, right? And so to say like this is the correct thing to do, or in this you don't know. Like, it depends on the situation, right? Depends on everything that's linked together. And yeah, you can make tactical analysis, of course you can, and we do, right? This is useful, but I just think that the abstracting of it and reduction of it to this kind of these X's and O's, just the numbers, I think is not. I just don't think it's real, right? Because I mean,
it's like it goes back to, I think, what you guys were saying before about notions of causality. Because to me, you've got kind of like a dog chasing its tail. Because, if I'm 1-against-1 with Jamie, and you say, all right, well, let's do a big statistical analysis. Should I dribble left or right? It's obviously a stupid question, just because, it's inherently unstable. If I go left, then he should go left, and so we're in this kind of a mutually opposed symmetrical situation that I don't think caters towards a stable solution. And that seems quite obvious in, say, 1v1, but then I don't see why, if you scale it up, that it shouldn't. But I think people get bogged down in seeing, oh, well, there's certain aspects that maybe constrain the game, like players probably won't get much faster. I think that's probably fair to say. Like, there's probably a cap on, say, how fast a human can run, or there's maybe certain things that are going to remain constant, like the size roughly of the pitch, the players. But for me, like, the things that matter are the things that are, they're not finite things that exist within like a bounded space that are trying to converge onto a stable solution. So I don't really see. I mean, I'm not really bothered when people talk about how they're gonna solve the game. I'm just like, all right, go right ahead.
But from a philosophical perspective, it's like, yeah, but that's not going to happen, maybe.
Yeah, but surely it's heuristically unhelpful as well, right? The way that if we're going to talk about causality and we're going to say, well, actually the causality isn't the way that you guys are thinking of it, then even them wasting their, I mean, yeah, sure, it's just a bunch of guys wasting their time doing maths or whatever. I don't know, but at the same time, surely it would be better if we sort of started tapping into those underlying assumptions and actually ended up with a space where people are a little bit more aware of the causality that underpins it. I think for me, like reading Foucault, and I've never really read Foucault. He's always sort of been on my horizon because of a lot of the stuff that I study, but I've only really read him this year, and it's just totally blown my mind. And I think because when you read Foucault and apply it to football, it's so generative. Because essentially in football, everyone operates with a sort of Humean causality, which is like everything's like billiard balls, everything knocks around against each other, and suddenly like out at the end pops Guardiola or Bielsa or something like that, which is just palpably untrue. But at the same, and you see it all the time. And Jamie and I were talking about Jonathan Wilson's History of Tactics, this sort of like grand theory of everything. And the thing that frustrates me about that is that people will say, "Oh, yeah, you know, Pep Guardiola's team, high pressers, whatever." But we were doing that back in the 70s, and you sort of take a really generalist aspect of the game and say, well, you know, it sort of bears some kind of like genetic similarity to that. Therefore, the causality must be that. It's sort of what like evolutionary biologists do, which is what you start at the end and then you sort of find these traits and then you explain why it is that they must be the way that they are. And what I love about Foucault is that he says, let's to talk about causality rather than looking on a plane and saying, right, well, this has happened here in football and this has happened here. He actually looks beyond that and says, well, what's going on in society in general? What can we talk about when we talk about society that explains why things might be the way that they are? And for example, the coronavirus thing is a great example because that probably will impact football in ways tactically and in terms of people's ability levels that in 20 years' time, people will be saying, oh, well, X coach came along and made these tactical decisions, when really actually there's just concrete reasons for why things changed, and we just responded to them, and we've intellectualized them rather than just looking for the underlying societal undercurrents that have actually impacted that. And I think that's a much more useful way of looking at the history of tactics, a sort of more sociology of tactics rather than this sort of classical grand theory of everything. It's almost like Wilson wants to be Stephen Hawking and sort of sit down and sort of get back to a Big Bang point and then be like, this is where all tactics started from, and now we're here. And so I think, but I'm interested to hear what you guys think of how that approach to causality might actually help us as coaches if we realize that there's more to it than simply saying, I'm just intellectually thinking of what is going to happen on the pitch and it happens, and there's no pushback from anything physical or material at all. It's just Nagelsmann sits down and says, this is how I want to play football, and all of his players suddenly enact that miraculously on a pitch, which doesn't happen.
Yeah, I think it seems to me that's what some people think, right? And it's like, well, that's kind of weird because, and maybe it's something you mentioned, like, oh, talking about sort of what is true and this kind of thing. And it seems to be like we've been focusing on, or I say we, let's say Western society more and wider, in recent times, the idea is that you make some kind of like propositional statement, right? I know that is the case. This is kind of this is truth, right? I can make some logical move and show why this is true, right? But there's more than that, right? There's more than that going on, and there's things like, you know, learning to juggle or ride a bike or something like that, or cradle a football like carefully, like skillfully. There's other ways of knowing, right? There's other ways of knowing than just an abstract propositional truth. And this is something John Vervaeke, who's someone we've been interested in, has been talking about, these different ways of knowing and different ways of knowing that things are true in as much as you can. And I think that's maybe something that isn't appreciated a lot, you know, as much as maybe it should be.
Yeah, I mean, for example, just to take a stupid example out of anywhere, but like Trent Alexander-Arnold, I think a lot of people will say Klopp has made his career because of his tactical decision to play him in a certain way, but there could be all kinds of reasons why Klopp decided to play that way, because Trent Alexander-Arnold comes through the youth system. There could be a youth coach who was particularly strong with fullbacks, for example, or it could be the case that he was playing football in his back garden, and the reason he's got a great shot is because he had to curl it around a tree. Like there's so many things like that where the actual causal explanations for what has happened go way beyond just simply Klopp sitting down and being like, right, we're going to suddenly start playing with attacking fullbacks.
Yeah, the bottom up.
You know who's good at pointing those out is Mark. Like he's always got those good little stories about like how something was just like a complete, just crazy coincidence that had some nonlinear.
Well, like he talks about Pavel Datsyuk, and apparently Pavel Datsyuk, he was so poor when he was growing up, he wasn't allowed to take slap shots because he would break his hockey stick. And so then this is some nonlinear reason why he developed such soft hands, because he had to maintain a hockey stick for so long or else he couldn't play.
Yeah, there's a story about a table tennis player who had like really good reactions, and they assumed that he just had really great natural reactions, and they tested his reactions and they were rubbish. They were worse than the guy who was testing the machine. But they found out that because he'd grown up playing table tennis in a scout hut, basically, that was too small really for the table, so he was always had to be dead close to the table. So he just developed the ability to react to the ball by playing in conditions where he had to have good reactions or he would never survive. So things like that.
Is there something going on here as well in the terms of this kind of this abstracting of thought away from the body, right? And just thinking that these things exist in this kind of intellectual vacuum up here somewhere, and people are so. I mean, even like right now, we're having a conversation, right? I can see Alex, but it's not actually Alex, right? It's like some kind of like digital reconstruction.
Here we go. We're getting to Baudrillard here, aren't we?
Yeah, well, you know. Well, the thing is,
like
John,
a dog to its vomit. You always back to
Jean. Yeah. Okay. The thing is, we avoided it on Thursday night, right? It didn't come up. So I thought, no, there's no fucking chance of getting away with it this time, right?
So we just all got to go to the parking lot at Disneyland to host this podcast.
Exactly. Right. So I mean, I know we can say it, Jeff. I'm kind of making it. I think there's something to it, right? There's this this idea that we can exist, let's say, without actually the participation of the embodiment of things, right? We can just talk about ideas and we can theorize and such and learn about things without actually doing it, right? And I suppose like the sort of the dystopian endpoint of that is just some kind of like virtual existence, right? We just plug into some virtual reality machine, and you just you don't actually experience reality. You don't interact with it, and you just go with the simulation, right? Is there an aspect of this happening?
Isn't it just a simpler explanation? It's just that we like to think that we're cleverer than we are. This comes back to what the media thing before, which is why all mainstream journalists want to go on about access, because they think it makes what they say about football more true. And I think the same is true about like the coaching world and the stats world, is that we want to believe that there is a causal link between what we think and things happening in the world. Which, like, I don't get me wrong, I'm no nihilist like you. I'm pretty convinced that when I act in the world and when I think, I can impact the world in that sense. But at the same time, I'm aware of the fact that there is no strong causality between the way that I think things happened and the way that things actually did happen. And I think for a lot of coaches, if you're a coach, you want that's maybe unfair, but like if you are doing something in which you're putting your brain to something and you want to see results happening in the world, you're going to probably overvalue the impact that you're having. And I think that's probably true in the media, and I think it's probably true in coaching and statistical analysis as well.
I think that's partially the claim that ecological psychology has in terms of being maybe a paradigm to view the game from, because it seems like it's a scientific endeavor, but it seems like it meshes quite nicely with that, whether you want to call it a postmodern or more philosophy as well, where it's about interaction, organism environment interaction. So
Heidegger and Nietzsche.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it precludes you from having that sort of a view from nowhere type of idea that's going to give you a privileged access, I suppose.
This is why all football coaches should be reading Maurice Merleau-Ponty, because
that's right.
Yeah.
Because he's right. The way that we think emerges from out of material interactions within the world. The way that we experience the world emerges from material interactions from this world. And as a coach, what you're trying to do is you're trying to help your players along that process, basically.
Yeah, so I think that's part of the reason why I do see a lot of scientism, and I do think some of the ways people apply maybe the ecological dynamics model can be heavy-handed, but I think it is the way, because it's not just a scientific model. It's like it's a whole different model of causality and a whole different model of thought, because it's a different idea of embodiment, maybe. So I think it kind of ties together a bunch of these things. And then there's, of course, questions about how it's applied. I know I think some people get claustrophobic when they feel like something like that enters the scene. And then they say, oh, it's just a flavor of the day. Like, hold on, like, it might not be true. But for me, it's like it's been really helpful just in how I think about it.
I see a lot of Heidegger here too in the way you're describing scientism. And I mean, he talks about truth as seeing as, and I really like this because you say, on the one hand, if I'm traveling, 30 kilometers at 100 kilometers an hour, I know from a scientific perspective how long it's going to take me to get there. But if I have good music on and I'm, listening to a podcast with Jamie and John on the way there, or my friends or whatever, then it goes by like that. So truth, maybe it's just our presuppositions around truth. And I wonder also if you think, John, that this narrative construction that the media does, that they might play a part into this cultural undercurrent that's happening.
Yeah, I'd have to think about that. I'm not very quick on my feet, but yeah, I mean, I'm a slave to Merleau-Ponty. I spent the last 6 years of my life before I went into the media, writing a PhD on the concept of human subjectivity in modern philosophy and how it was impacted by Protestantism. And I spent a lot of time arguing in that there's more than one modernism. There's more than one modern philosophy. There's a strand of modernism which avoids that mind-body dualism that so much of modern philosophy does end up with, but it's that embodied way of thinking. And I find it just a much more beneficial way of thinking, particularly as someone who thinks a lot about football now. And yeah, Merleau-Ponty has that same. I mean, it's the same. It's ready to hand and present at hand, isn't it? The Heideggerian distinction. And I just find that such a fascinating distinction, because it's clearly obvious that sometimes when we're engaged in the world, we're engaged purely as material bodies, and we have a sort of knowledge of the world that isn't stepped back, intellectual, applying our thought onto the world. It's just simply living in the world. It's picking up a hammer and using it without thinking about it. It's using a PlayStation controller as though it's, and again, that's Michael Polanyi, isn't it? Like it's an extension of our body, and it becomes part of our body. And we don't even think about the fact that if you're holding a game controller, that you're even holding something else. I think that, again, with football, that's really important, because that you have to be aware of the interaction of those two types of knowledge. You have to have that bodily knowledge, which is so important for muscle memory, repetitions, etc., etc. But you also need to have, I think, to a certain extent, that ability to step back and do decision-making knowledge, where you're saying, right, what tactically should I do here? What is better for me to do? Should I lay the ball out wide, or should I push it long? And yeah, I mean, obviously there's going to be an overlap between those two. There's going to be an inherence. So I'm fully on board with that approach to knowledge. But when it comes to the media, I've no idea how they've played into that. But I think it's just like anything, right? And intellectually speaking, we fit into a worldview which falls into that mind-body dualism just naturally. And again, the reason why scientism is so prevalent is probably because we're so used to that idea where we kind of think, if you just apply your brain in the best way, you end up with some kind of like Vienna Circle approach to knowledge, right? Where you're saying, basically, as a football statistician, I'm trying to represent the world, but in numbers. And that's an attractive. I think that's an attractive approach to most people intrinsically in our society.
Is there something about you mentioned, Johnny mentioned something about maybe it's just people just want to be right, and they just like the idea that they can get things correct. And I don't know much Heidegger, but there's this idea of concealedness, right? Where when you mention interaction with things, and there's this idea that as much as I understand it, that so let's take football. I'm interested in football, and it's close to me. But then the idea would be something like that, which is closest to me, is concealing the most from me, right? That the more I'm interested in football, the more I don't know about it, right? And the more I'm wrong, essentially, because I'm learning. It's always being, the amount that is being concealed is always increasing, right? the
I think
more that
it's
I
like
bring it
you said
into
before, it's
presence.
like you wake up in the middle of the game.
Right. And
Thrownness.
then this,
Yeah.
and this is then this. It's like I need to be. I don't want to be certain. That certainty is not doesn't seem to be good, right? In that sense, I mean, you want to be being comfortable with uncertainty, with this. I don't know, right? But the more I don't know, that's good, right? Because
Socratic humility.
Truth is a moment
Yeah.
rather than a
yeah,
state of mind. So you come across these clearings in the woods where
right.
suddenly everything makes sense, and then before you know it, again you're back in the woods.
Yeah.
It's not that enlightenment is something where you're progressively sort of learning more and more and more. You're constantly walking through the woods and coming across these moments at which you tacitly understand things and things make sense, and it's not that kind of mental acuity. It's more to do with, oh, suddenly everything has been revealed to me, right? The notion of truth as having its own power to give itself to you, rather than you being the one who has the power to find it.
Yeah. I suppose that's where we are just now as well with this COVID virus, right? It's just the uncertainty here is, I suppose it's difficult. We're having to live in uncertainty right now, right? And it's quite jarring because the routine's gone, the daily things that we that we just busy ourselves with are just stopped. When's it going to end? Don't know. How bad's it going to get? Don't know. We don't know.
And you talked about wanting to be right. That also might be this idea. Okay, I'm in football. Everything is uncertain. I need something to hold on to so that I can feel like I've got some certainty. And maybe this is what Nietzsche talks about with people can't handle the flux. They can't handle the fact that things are constantly changing all the time. So they need some truth. I've definitely felt that way in my coaching career in the past, for sure.
Yeah, it just seems like a more sort of humble way to approach things, and rather than this, look at this stat, this player is bad or good. Like, it's like, okay, hang on, right? Like, and I know people on that. We have to make some claims, right, and all the rest of it. But I think there seems to be that kind of hubris about a lot of the the way people talk about, well, not just football, but everything, I suppose.
Especially if you're winning or if you're successful.
Right. Yeah. And maybe it's that more. Just I think I just feel like there's maybe a room. There's room for people to bring in. Being comfortable with uncertainty a bit more and valuing uncertainty more than certainty. Right. I think that's maybe some kind of shift that might be useful.
I've been reading Finite and Infinite Games by James Carse, which I really like. But I think he describes like the fundamental mindsets as being like finite players prepare against surprise. Like, so you're trying to be prepared to handle what comes to you. But infinite players prepare for surprise. So it's like you're trying to put yourself in a position where you're going to have, I think, like Arthur was saying, the violent shocks to your thought, or something that's going to make you say, like, oh my God, I didn't realize I had been seeing it like that. And now, but it's a difficult shift to make because it's somewhat uncomfortable.
Yeah, but I think it's in terms of, and look, I think it's useful for people to form these views and put them out there. This is what's so great about football is that you do get this multiplicity of views, right? Multiplicity of interpretations, and I suppose I'm always just banging this drum of, let's try and hold as many together as possible, rather than following one strand too heavily. Although, there's maybe benefits of that in certain times.
Like the brilliant thing is, like, in the midst of all of this, it's like it's a zero-sum game.
This is the thing, right?
If I beat you, what are you going to tell me? Like, and I kind of love that because it
and that happened with Klopp and Simeone recently, right?
Been suffering over this years. I think John, you wrote a piece on that, I think, a while ago. Where it's just like, I can't win, and if I win, they want something else. But I love that, to be honest. It's kind of tortured, but I like it.
Yeah, I think it's the same with elections as well, isn't it? This is one of the things that really frustrates me about elections, is that whoever wins, essentially their strategy is considered to be good, which is just wild. Not least because, like, we're in a situation in the UK where the losing parties, literally all of their manifesto promises are now being rolled out that we've got a pandemic, and again, so much of this has got to do with media as well, right, framing everything. But it seems mad to me that, like, literally, if no one campaigned in an election, people voted, if there was literally no approach to any of this, there would still be a winner. And it would say absolutely nothing about their approach as well, and that's the reductio ad absurdum that no one ever really appreciates. So, as someone who's on the left of the Labour Party, I'm always hearing people being like, "Well, your party, your hero lost. That's it now. You're out." Like nothing that they said is useful for anyone, which is again, it's crazy, but that's life, right?
So we talked. Sorry, David, were you gonna go?
No, go ahead.
Go on. Well, I just think we talk a lot about this. Maybe there's an issue with some of the approaches we've been taking. Maybe there's an overemphasis on the scientific worldview, and I don't know where from here. Right? Does it change? Can anyone see it changing anytime soon? Any kind of you don't use the term paradigm shift, or is there going to be? Are we continuing on this course? Is something like the virus going to jolt people away from it? Is it going to? I don't know. It seems to be like a time at the moment where things are uncertain, and maybe that's an opportunity for different ways of thinking, of different ways of acting to come around. I don't know. It's be a tough one because the paradigm is pretty dominant of what you would call like a capitalist, materialistic way of looking at the world. But I don't know. Maybe these moments are little cracks, and maybe that's where opportunity is. I don't know. Maybe I'm being optimistic.
I have zero optimism about the paradigm changing. I know I'm a pessimistic bugger, but like I think we're going to get on top of this virus quite quickly, and there won't be as many deaths as the figures that they were talking about immediately. And I think whenever it comes to pandemic mitigation, when you're successful, people think that the threat wasn't really ever that serious. And I think that's where we'll get to. We'll get to it, and it will just be the same gammons. It'll be our parents' generation being like, I don't know what you were stressed about. Fewer people died than would have died during the flu season or something like that. And they won't take into account the fact that literally the world shut down for 3 months or something in order to offset that. But for that reason, I'm not particularly sanguine about the chances of a paradigm shift, to be honest.
Yeah, no, I'm maybe more. I think there's some.
You believe in humans too much, Jamie. That's your problem.
Yeah.
Now who's the nihilist?
I've been let down by humans far too regularly to have that opinion.
I didn't bite on the nihilist slur earlier on.
Active nihilism is fine, though. Active nihilism is fine. It's passive nihilism is the problem.
Right. Okay. Yeah, no, I can just see a lot of people losing faith in these kinds of in some of the things we've been talking about. But you got and maybe I just again it's just projecting what I'm thinking, but people are pretty dissatisfied with the way things are being organised. And
are they? The Tories are up to 50% approval ratings now from like 40 or something. You literally
Trump
all you
is
have
the highest.
Yeah, exactly. All you have to do to come out well here is just be on TV, and people are like, "Well, he's on TV. He's probably doing things okay."
Maybe that's true, and I'm just talking, just from maybe that's I haven't got my finger on the pulse.
This is why you all need to read Foucault, mate, because it's got nothing to do with intellectualism. It just happens. It's just stuff happening everywhere, and it's all the stuff that we're not aware of that really influences these things.
That's why he looked at like old police records and stuff like that to get like archaeology, right?
Yeah.
Well, I think this is what generally the side of the coin we've been coming down on, as well as this. There is as we're all coaches, there is in coaching a lot of the idea of there being this is the one way to do it, and people selling their products of how to coach and how the best way to interpret football is, but seems like it's turtles all the way down, right? That's
why we need more heroes. Right? Well, that's why we need heroes like I don't know. Obviously, John, you probably did, but that Wani Wemena guy on Twitter is amazing, and he posts all those Bielsa videos with the subtitles. And I watched one of them recently, and again, I think that we do need something like Nietzsche talks about in terms of a gay science, some merging between romanticism and the scientism. And I love it because in the first couple minutes, Bielsa goes, there are these formations, and I can basically prove it, but that's not important. So there you have the science on the one hand. And then on the other hand, he's like, and I know a lot of people say, oh, you know, you have to start with the qualities of your players, or you have to start with your idea, or some mix in between. But I just have to sell my ideas to my players. And even a player who can't get it, I'll spend my whole life trying to convince him of it. So I think on the one hand, you have this really authentic expression of who he is. And then on the other hand, you have this analytic, scientific side. So I see a merge there between those two aspects with him. And so maybe we just need more heroes like that.
You definitely get that in Bielsa, which is, on the one hand, he'll say something like, if all players were robots, I would never lose. But at the same time, he also sort of has like, he'll touch on a sort of musical metaphor where he'll talk about how he needs to have the script in order that he can have certain virtuosos playing along to the tune. So it's not ad-libbing, it's improvisation on a theme, and you can't ever improvise unless you're playing the theme correctly. So he's always kind of between those two things, I think, where he's saying, I need the collective to be great, but it's only within the context of the collective that the individuals on my team can ever really thrive.
Yeah, I find that really interesting.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense, and it kind of marries up with a lot of them, with a lot of things we've been talking about. But I'm mindful of time, John. We're getting on a wee bit. I don't know if there's anything else anyone is keen to bring up, or.
I think real quick, I was just gonna say we were talking about results and then maybe the aesthetics of the game, but I think maybe I'm influenced from reading Cars and Finite Infinite Games, but I think it's somewhat of a false distinction if you really scale it out, because like say American baseball, they've just changed the rules that the pitcher can only wait so long between pitches, right? And a lot of the purists were upset. But what they realized is that like nobody's watching the game anymore. So, on some level, you have this finite zero-sum game that you're just competing to win, however within the rules that you can. But then on some level, that game has to also go on. And if that game loses all of its audience, then that game stops. So it's interesting how you've got kind of, how I see it, it's like they're kind of nested. So I don't see it as being like such a hard and fast distinction where it's like you need to win, and that is a pragmatic black and white thing. But also, if you only win in certain ways, then it may eventually kill the game off.
Okay.
Isn't that the VAR phenomenon as well in football?
Yeah.
When it gets treated too much as an object in being correct or right, you lose that aesthetic aspect that actually most people are watching the game for.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Yeah,
I was sitting there as I was going to say something way more profound than that.
No, I think this is I think that's what is so beguiling about football, right? It's that paradoxical nature to it, which, yeah, like you say, I think the infinite game and the finite game is a good way of looking at it, and it's clear that just winning is not necessarily the optimal way to play.
A tacit understanding of that.
Right, I think so too.
Know how to express it.
Yeah. So I
always recommend Joe Kennedy's book, Game Without Frontiers, or Game Beyond Borders, or Game something. I can't remember what it is.
Without Frontiers, I think it is.
Yeah. And he has a chapter in there where he basically compares football fandom to like modernism's literature, modernism's understanding of how we sort of come to terms with the world. And I think that's a really helpful way of talking about this, because he always says in that I think he uses like Walter Benjamin to talk about love at last sight rather than love at first sight. And it's that experience of lumping so much meaning and desire on the final moment at which you win a game. By the time you've won it, it's almost receded into the past already. And so we're always constantly having to find another point at which we're saying, well, once this happens, then I'll be happy. And then once this happens, then I'll be happy. But when you actually experience that winning game, there's almost like a deflation of expectation because you've put so much hope into it.
I don't know if you read Lacan.
Yeah, sure. Jouissance and the objet prière, right? The death drive of, and I think it's true. I think that I do think that. So, for example, being a Leeds fan at the moment, all Leeds fans are just going on and on and on and on about voiding the league. And if it's voided, then it's terrible, and it will just call into question everything. And I just kind of think, if we went up next season, we wouldn't be happy. There'd be something else beyond that we would be looking for then. And you just constantly building those things, those moments at which like you're at the end. It's that love at last sight. And then as soon as you get there, you're just like, well, is that it really? It feels as like everything's past already, and I've not been able to enjoy it as fully as my expectations set me up to enjoy it as well. So again, I don't know, as a football fan, I've tried to enjoy the process as much as the means as much as the end as well. And I found that really good, especially with Bielsa, because like the means are so enjoyable to experience. And we've not had that for so many years. So for me, I'm more disappointed about this season not finishing because I'll miss out on like 9 games of Bielsa or something. So, but I don't know, maybe that's just me being pompous but I do find as though like enjoying the experience of the game or trying to focus on that when I'm as a fan, rather than being like, we've got to win all the time, because it just gets you into these really, I think, toxic ways of thinking about the future as well. So. Anyway, that's completely off the ball.
Oh, go ahead.
No. I was rambling.
Well, I think what it is partially when you have, I don't know, I'm not as familiar with Walter Benjamin, but the love at last sight. Like if you have some of these moments, like let's say you win any major, tournament or something, there's like a brief moment where it kind of retroactively confirms or creates maybe some narrative that like, for like a brief moment, maybe you feel like you actually, have it in your hands. But then, of course, I guess that dissipates. But I don't know if maybe it's that flux of like the certainty and uncertainty. And it's like you get those brief moments and it's like you almost get there. And then, the final whistle blows and everyone celebrates. And then like it retroactively creates like a certain, like you said, even just like with an election, like somebody wins and oh, that was a brilliant thing. But, it's only in that moment.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, no, I think well, if we can take anything away from it, it's
get to the end of this podcast and we'll all be like, oh,
exactly. Yeah, exactly.
I'd set it up for so much.
Last night we can say that most definitely about this conversation. Yeah. Well, yeah, I'm mindful of your time, John. So, no, thanks so much for coming on. That was
thank you, John.
Great.
Thanks for having me on. I'm sorry that I've talked too much. You guys have got way more interesting things to say on this topic than I do, and I do feel as though I've dominated the conversation. But I've really enjoyed it. It was great fun, and loads of ideas running around my head now, which is always good.
No, it's great to talk, and hopefully we can do it again soon. And maybe it'll be interesting to see what the situation is like in the world when we do it next. Yeah, who knows, right, at this point. But thanks so much, John. Awesome. Great. Thank you so much.
Thanks, guys.
All right. Take care.
Cheers. Bye-bye.